Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. The GDP numbers, or the gross domestic product numbers for FY21, the financial year 21, were released earlier this week. The numbers look disappointing to say the least. We have contracted by 7.3% in the financial year that we've closed up. There's a couple of things to look at within that figure, though. One is this narrative that all the world is suffering and in that we are not alone. However, if you look more closely, this dip in growth is not something that has happened to us just within this year. For 5 out of the 7 years that the current government has been in power, growth has been decelerating, and you've been seeing that slippage quarter after quarter. There's a couple of other things that stand out in terms of this GDP figure. One being the fact that we have never seen this kind of contraction in the last many decades. The last time we saw this was all the way back in 1979, 1980. There's a few markers that really point out to what's happened with India's growth. So let me start, of course, with demonetization. That happened to be in 2016 the biggest blow and the first blow to the Indian economy. It was followed up by a very ham handed rollout of GST, or goods and services tax. That seemed to be the next stop. And of course, the fact that the banking and financial system was sagging and heaving under the weight of bad loans did not help the situation. Net result, we had growth slipping on many parameters. Unfortunately, this time, some of those verticals or pillars that held us up have not because of the pandemic. So, for example, the services sector has actually seen some pretty bad slippage, and there is a bit of a question mark on where sectors like travel and tourism go, particularly given what the first part of this year has shaped up to be, and the second wave, and how brutal it has been. The growth rate, then, just to reiterate, has fallen steadily from about 8% in FY17 to about 4% in FY20. And here we are at the end of FY21 with the contraction that we're looking at. Joining me to talk about what this portends to in the months ahead and what India should brace itself for on the growth parameters is Anant Narayan. He's a professor of finance at SPJIMR. But what I wanted to say before that is that he's a man who's been watching the financial market and the economy for decades now and really has a finger on the pulse of what's happening in these different streams. Anand, thank you for joining in and chatting with me about the GDP figures and, of course, a whole lot else that I'm sure we'll address. But I want to first talk about this narrative, if you may, about how what we've just closed up is an outlier year. Do you agree with that observation?
Well, I guess things haven't been looking great over the past few years now, Mitali. Our GDP growth has been coming down over the years. I guess you could say this year was exceptional because of the pandemic and the lockdown that we had. But it's been a debilitatingly exceptional year, and I think we'll see the impact of that going forward as well. Summary, Mitali, look, India's economy is not in great shape. There are plenty of soft spots, plenty of things to worry about. The good news, if you want to take out anything from it, I don't think India has any problem that is beyond a solution, but it will take a hell of a lot of hard work for us to get out of this particular hole.
Let me talk about the internals for a second, Anant, and what you made of the GDP figures themselves and what you're most worried about, because some of the stuff is clear, right? Services is in pain, travel and tourism has been hit. What are the meaningful takeaways from the figures that we saw for you?
So the first meaningful takeaway, Mitali, is what's not in the figures. Look, the way in which we compute GDP at this stage is largely based on high frequency data. Now, a lot of India is informal. A lot of India is mom and pop shops and micro and small and medium enterprises. In fact, I think the chief economic advisor mentioned in the 2019 July economic survey, about 93% of India's workforce is in informal sector. Niti Aayog puts it at 85%. So a substantial chunk of Indians work in the informal sector. We don't have a great way of capturing that data in our GDP estimates at this stage. There are estimates which say that 50% of India's GDP comes from informal sector, right? Now, we will get some, We will revisit this data in January next year, and thereafter, when we do something called the ASI, Annual Survey of Industries, we will incorporate data about the informal sector. But at this stage, we simply don't know. And there seems to be two narratives, Mithali, and both of which seem equally true. So if you look at the formal sector, if you look at the companies listed on BSE or NSE, they're doing incredibly well compared to what we're seeing around us. Economic Times has that lovely website where they show the running rate of what's the results looking like. 1,000 odd companies have given the results for March quarter. I think their profits are up by 50% year on year for the whole year, which is incredible. I mean, given what we have gone through. So the formal sector is doing well. They've managed to cut costs. They've managed to preserve their bottom lines, in fact, expand their bottom lines, and they're doing well. But that's a sliver of the economy. Now, equally, you have very, very distressing data coming out from the likes of CMIE or from that Azim Premji study, which I've seen you quoting in social media, which paint a terrible picture of what's happening in the informal sector. Now, given the intensity of the lockdown that we saw, Mithali, I think that minus 7.3% headline that we see for growth is a grossly misleading number. The actual number is of two, the formal and the informal part. And if you actually incorporate the true picture of the informal sector, which I don't know what it looks like, it's probably a double-digit contraction, which now it's gone behind us. Hopefully we've seen the worst, but it's important for us to recognize the pain which is there in that part that we don't see, the bottom of the iceberg, which we're not seeing, rather than just concentrate on the top. Thereafter, Mithali, once we take that into account, hopefully there are good things happening as well. So hopefully we get our vaccination act together. Hopefully numbers like GST, which are very, very encouraging, they play out on the formalization theme, etc. But as I mentioned earlier, what worries me, there's a lot of damage we've taken over the years on the economy. And three things which worry me specifically, Mithali. First is the health of the financial services ecosystem. It's not enough if it survives. Of course it will survive, but we need that to fund our growth aspirations. It's in no position to do that. And I don't see enough work happening on that. Related to that, several sectors that were in chronic stresses, even before COVID hit us, power, real estate, telecom, airline and shipping, MSMEs, related to this issue of financial sector, you have to resolve these issues as well in these particular sectors. And finally, what worries me the most about that CMIE data, we are losing jobs, Mithali. The industry, manufacturing used to employ close to 60 million people as per CMIE data about 5 years ago. Today, it's less than 30 million people. We've lost half our manufacturing jobs. And this is not today as in the midst of the second wave. This is March of 2021, before the second wave hit us. Overall, we seem to have lost something like 32 million jobs in overall manufacturing, including construction, etc. These are terrible numbers, right? So we need to create jobs and output in this country. We are a country of young aspirational people who need jobs, who need to create output. We seem to be failing on that front. So these three things, the state of the financial services ecosystem, the state of several sectors under chronic stresses, and our chronic inability to create jobs and output, these worry me a lot. And this is nothing to do with COVID. This is beyond COVID.
Yeah. Anand, and I just want to take a tangent here in our conversation. Just like there is a small percentage that has been unaffected by the pandemic, or not affected to a great degree, as that Azim Premji report pointed out. Do you fear that there's a similar sort of perception being built with the few companies that have managed to also tide this crisis? I mean, for the companies that you talked about that turned out great profits, as you said, there's such a small percentage of even our, sort of industrial world. It does not include the SMEs. And like you said, this is profit. It's not growth. So the reason there are no jobs is because they're doing a very efficient job of cost cutting via cutting jobs. Does it worry you that people are clinging on to these sort of perceptions of what's happening at the very top end and completely ignoring the devastation below?
It does worry me, Mithali. Look, the way this is also becomes a political discussion, unfortunately. It should not be. It should be an economic discussion.
Well,
Yeah, as I think Professor Pranab Sen is fond of saying, economics is about politics. But anyway, we'll come back to what you're saying. I think both parts are true. It's not that one is phantom and the other is, is real. There is a part of the economy which is doing well, and it's not a small sliver, Mitali. If all companies which are listed are doing well, they're doing well. That's okay. We can live with that. It's not a problem. If GST numbers are at 1,40,000 crores plus in a month, that tells you something is going right. So that's fine. That this is a good chunk of the economy doing well. But the point is, we know that informal sector is 50% of our economy at least, right? If not more. We know it employs at least 85% of our workforce. Now, while we don't have official data around this as yet, there's a lot of research from a lot of universities, a lot of houses, a lot of think tanks, a lot of NGOs, and from, of course, CMI telling you that there's a problem there. And it's visible to us, right? Especially after the second wave, Mitali, you can make out the rural sector is in trouble. You can make out that, MSME distress, micro distress has gone up. Now, here is what, imagine that you and I are doctors, or let's say the North Block is a doctor, and you're trying to improve, or you're trying to make our life better as a country as a whole, right? You've got to diagnose the situation correctly, right? This thing about let's come out with a positive picture, you can do that once you've got your medical reports. You don't if you've got blood pressure and cholesterol, you don't make life positive by saying, I don't have blood pressure or cholesterol. You accept the fact that you have that. And then you come to the positive point. These are absolutely resolvable issues. So where I do get uncomfortable with this veering towards either a very positive negative or a very negative narrative negative, the reality is reports are in front of us. Let's just look at it objectively. We know there's a problem on employment. We know there's a problem in micro enterprises. And yes, some companies in the top are doing well, in the formal space are doing well. That's a fact as well. If we need our country to do well, if we need our GDP to grow to $5 trillion, if we need our per capita to go to a middle income country, we know a lot of things have to happen, particularly for that bottom half that we are not recognizing at this point in time. So, but again, the bottom line, if you're looking for positive news, I think the medical reports look pretty bad, and they're worse than what the narrative in the formal media is at this point in time. Far worse. The positive news is, even if you acknowledge the reports for what they actually are, this is not this is solvable. This is not a chronic illness which is beyond redemption. Nothing like that. This is blood pressure and cholesterol, which can be brought down with some hard steps. That's the positive part, really, to take away from here.
Let me approach it a different way then, Anant. I mean, I take your point about the fact that some of the corporates, or many of the corporates, are doing very well. They're, holding their head above the water. There is an entire unorganized sector which we can explain, saying we don't have enough data to have a handle on how bad the situation is. But there's also this enormous space in the middle, Anant. I mean, you're looking at GDP per capita that has now slid back 3 years. It's gone back to the 16-17 time. You can see that in terms of what's happening with the private consumption and how that's contracting. Again, the CMI data, as you said, 97% households have felt a change in income. That's a lived experience. Do you recall a time when the crunch was so personal that it was impacting every household in this way?
I don't think any of us have seen anything like this, Mitali. Clearly, it's a 1 in 100-year pandemic. Probably our ancestors of 100 years ago would have seen something like this. Look, we are where we are. We can't change what happened with respect to the pandemic. We can't change what happened pre the pandemic either. I would look forward, Mitali, and look at what is it that the current medical reports tell us about the health of the economy, and therefore what could be a treatment procedure which we could follow from here. As I said, the good news is, the way I see it, the medical reports indicate things are bad, but there is nothing that I've seen as yet which is beyond redemption and beyond a solution. Okay. Yes, it does worry me that we don't seem to be looking at the medical reports right as yet. We are still looking at, for instance, the Nifty being at all-time highs, the rupee being very strong. So the markets are singing a tune which doesn't resonate with what seems to be happening in the larger economy. And that's confusing. That's confusing for everybody. I mean, how the hell do you explain what's happening right now? I think we've got to try and make sense of all the stuff that we're seeing. The reality is markets are doing their own thing. They're not talking to what's happening in the broader economy. And this divergence can continue globally as well as in India. But recognize the problems and then start addressing them. Lots of work to be done. They can be done. Nothing is beyond redemption. You can solve the banking crisis. You can solve the sectoral crisis. You can go on this path of Atmanirbhar Bharat and create jobs and output. And of course, more medium term, one lesson to take away from this intense, issues that we've seen over the last few months, we have to invest in health, in education, in nutrition, and in public services, water, sanitation, all of that. Our investments there have to multiply by 2 or 3 times. I'm supposed to be a fiscal hawk. I will tell you, blow up the fisc and put money in those areas. It doesn't matter. It'll pay for itself, right? So I would look at what can be done going forward. Am I happy about what's happening so far, and are we on the right path? No. Do I think it can be corrected? I think it can be corrected.
Some of this is mapped, Anant. I mean, as we've been discussing, we've been watching this, slow deceleration. I think the one island, if you may, and right after last year was what was happening with the rural economy. I want to go back to the point that you were making about how you're worried about the rural economy, because I think people tend to equate rural economy with agriculture, which is not going to be the case. The tractor numbers and agriculture may still remain strong, but that large chunk of daily wage laborers, as you said, are all a big part of rural India. What do you fear might happen there? And what do you think we can do to address that right away? More NREGA, more direct transfers. What do we have to do?
Great question, Mithali. And you're right. By the way, I think the data suggests that just 45% of the rural economy is agriculture. So more than half of economic activity in the rural sector is from non-agriculture. And by the way, 65% of India lives in the rural sectors. So it's a big part of the economy. Now, the worry I have is that last year the recovery that you saw in the formal sector, FMCGs, in tractors, as you said, in even cars for that matter, it was a lot of it was demand coming from the rural side, right? So you had a few things happening which were good the last year for the rural economy through COVID-1. First, rural side didn't seem to get as much impacted. So yes, you did see a lot of workers going back to the villages, but the villages themselves were not that much impacted. Second, therefore, your services and manufacturing in the rural sector were not as impacted as they were in the urban and semi-urban areas. Third, there was a lot of money which was pumped into the rural sector. So NREGA is one angle, as you rightly mentioned. Second, FCI did a lot of procurement. It did record levels of procurement. It increased its number of procurement centers by 50%. It made sure that farmers got money, right? So there was money pumped into the rural sector. Ignoring the migrant workers who went there, they were obviously worse off after having gone there. The people who are already there to start with in the rural economy actually did pretty well, and that held up consumption. So the point about consumption, numbers were being held up by a reasonably resilient rural sector. Where this could break down this going forward, at least the report suggests that this time around, the spread of the pandemic has been a lot more intense in rural sectors, right? Now, the good news is the infection numbers are coming down very, very sharply. Of course, they're understated, but nevertheless, the worst is behind us. It's all coming down now. Hopefully, therefore, it's a sharp reversal. Things, settle down. But if so many rural households, Mithali, have got impacted, if they've gone through a fever, if they've gone through a cough, if they've seen death in villages, one hears of villages of 500, 800 people, where you would see 1 or 2 deaths in 6 months. Now you are seeing 1 death every day, and you have seen a month of 1 death every day. So people are scared. So you've been hit personally. You've had to have medical expenses. So therefore your household savings are down. Your employment has come down. You've not been able to work through the harvest season. And now you're also scared to go out and consume. So we don't know how that will play out. Again, we are conjecturing out here. So I'm guessing therefore that the recovery in the economy compared to last year can be a lot slower. So what this can do, Mithali, is actually drag down the formal sector as well. We keep worrying about, or we keep wondering as to when that convergence between the formal and informal can happen. This can be one route that the rural actually drags it down. To your second part, which is what can be done. Look, clearly some kind of relief has to be given. There are people whose, if you go by the Azim Premji research report, that is a scary set of statistics. 220 million people below the poverty line the last 1 year. If that, even if that number is half correct, it's a terrible number to start with, right? Incomes down substantially, 17-18% for a bulk of those people. The point which you've re-emphasized, 20% of the population actually losing all income. I mean, these are terrible statistics. So one thing which we did well the last year was take care of food security. 900 million people, at least in theory, had access to free food if required, right? That has to be continued. We don't have a choice. We can't let food security not be there. This time around, if people need money for sustenance, given that they've lost a lot of money in medical spending, it's paradoxical. In a country like India, we have a lot of private expenses for medical reasons. But if that is required, then you have to put money in people's hands in some form, shape, or the other. Call it PM Kisan Yojana, call it Narega, call it whatever. But you have to put money in the hands of people who need it for sustenance. This is going to cost money, but given the nature of the pandemic, given the nature of the relief required, I think it has to be spent. But then it again comes down to the medium term, Mithali. There is a limit to how much you can sustain an economy by simply putting money in the hands of people. I know there are a whole bunch of economists who are saying we have to recreate demand, you have to push up demand. The problem, as I see it, is not just that. You can't only talk about demand. The fact is we are terrible at creating domestic output. We've seen this movie before in 2009, 2013. You start Narega, you give money into people's hands, you blow up the fisc, and you hope that demand will then create its own supply. It didn't happen that way. We ended up actually having limited domestic output. Therefore, our inflation went up and our imports went up tremendously. It wasn't just oil. It was electronics, it was plastics, it was toys, it was all kinds of intermediates, chemicals, fertilizers, everything. Even today, if you see the trade data, Mithali, for the last many, many months, it tells you how poor our terms of trade really are. We are not good at making stuff that we need. We end up importing much of the stuff that we create demand for. So if you only give money in the hands of people, you are inevitably going to face inflation. Anyway, the global context for inflation is not looking great. And if you don't get output and jobs to go along with this demand creation, you're going to push up imports to a point where even our large amount of FX reserves will not be enough. 3-4 years from now, you might suddenly find the buffer of FX reserves is simply not enough. So it has to be multi-pronged, Mithali. You have to have sustenance money given out right now. You have to take care of people and ensure that nobody is hard up and they can sustain themselves. Beyond that, yes, if you're pushing the demand lever, you've got to make sure Atmanirbhar Bharat works and output and jobs follows as well. And this is the part for the last 15 years that we've absolutely not got right. Getting the output up, getting jobs created, that's not really happened. And that's the part which desperately needs a solution.
A lot of what you point to as urgent needs, Anant, are fiscal imperatives. And frankly, we were quite tight-fisted in terms of what we did on fiscal policy, whereas on monetary policy, we were quite nimble through all of last year. How much space and context does monetary policy have in this year, particularly given the point you were making about inflation as well? How much can they do, and what do you think they ought to be thinking about right now?
Right. So here is a question I like asking my students, Mithali, before I come to your answer. What is the monetary policy framework of People's Bank of China, PBOC? I can tell you, even seasoned economists, I'm not a trained economist, but even seasoned economists struggle to answer that question. Okay. The point is, in countries like India and China, it's not monetary policy or fiscal policy that ultimately determines our future economic future. It's the real economy. It's about jobs and output. China did a lot of things wrong. They fudged data. They don't have a lot of the freedom that we have. One thing they got right, they created jobs and output in excess of their own demand. They became the manufacturing capital of the world. So the starting point, I would say, is it's not so much fisc, it's not so much monetary. There are supplementary factors. It's actually getting on the ground, things like land, things like capital, things like labor laws, things like ease of doing investments, things like stability of policy, all of that right, so that we start to create jobs and output. If we do that, it doesn't matter what monetary policy we follow. That's point number one. On the second part, look, I would like a lot more of the fiscal lever to be used. Absolutely. I think you're right in using the phrase tight-fisted. I would like to see it go into a lot more of the first thing that I mentioned, which is supporting the real economy. It should be going towards creating jobs and output, right? Of course, there is money for sustenance required as well, but make sure money goes into infrastructure, into deep sea ports, into R&D, into education, into healthcare, stuff which will allow you to create an ecosystem of jobs and output, right? So that's again medium term, but it can be done. Monetary policy, you're absolutely right. I think the last year, Governor Das and the RBI did step up. They gave moratorium, they gave regulatory relief and forbearance, they gave liquidity. They were ahead of the curve in trying to ease the pain to the system, which is great, right? But there are limits to what monetary policy can do, Mithali, at this point in time, particularly. Look, what can you do? You can actually monetize the deficit. You can essentially give money to the government to say, do what you have to do. And by the way, we can get away with it for a while because we've had some forced austerity for the last 1 year. Our imports were low. Global liquidity was high. So we're sitting on tons of dollars, record $590 billion of FX reserves, plus $70 billion of forward purchases of dollars. We've never seen so much dollars in our life before. We've got plenty of FX buffers. Normally, when you follow a very, very loose monetary policy, two things happen: the risks, inflation and a currency crisis. The second risk for now does not exist because we've got plenty of FX buffers, okay? Which therefore gives the RBI the ability to do what they're doing, which is keep interest rates low, give lots of surpluses to the government for them to spend, buy government bonds to, effectively monetize the fiscal deficit. All of that they can do and get away with. But there are limits to this, and this has a lot of risks for the medium to long term, okay? I know there is a lot of clamor even now saying, RBI, why is the curve so high? Why is overnight rate 3.35%? Your 10-year bond is 6%. Bring it down even further. For what? Are you seeing investments going up because of interest rates coming down? Who wants to invest right now in the private sector? How do we imagine that pushing on this monetary string can push up growth? It's not going to happen. We're not seeing it. Interest rate is hardly the determinant of either demand or investment at this point in time. On the contrary, what's happening, Mithali, is real rates have been kept really, really low because the RBI has forced the 10-year bond yield at 6%, despite the government borrowing record levels of money. Savers like you and me, your parents, my mother, they're getting terrible returns. The average fixed deposit rate amongst the banks all put together is below 5.4% weighted average. This is the lowest we've ever seen before. At a time when inflation expectations, as per RBI surveys, is 10.4% in 3 months. That's a 5% negative return. So what's that doing, Mithali? You've got a lot of money being created by government spending and monetization happening. That money is not finding good places to invest in, to put into fixed deposits or earn a decent return on. A lot of that money is going into equity markets. It's going into gold. It's going into Bitcoin. You're effectively creating the asset bubble that RBI has warned us of. So here is my point. RBI has done a great job of providing relief to the economy. It has to be complemented. It's also done a good job of maintaining FX volatility at a low level while it accumulated reserves. That's giving us a lot of buffers. Great. But if you keep pressing the monetary lever, you're going to create asset price inflation. You're going to create bubbles that it's warning us of. You're going to exacerbate this formal versus informal divide we're seeing. It's almost obnoxious that there are people who are becoming billionaires at a time when there is so much of distress in the economy. And that's partly being funded by this global as well as local, loose monetary policy and low real rate of return. Eventually, this low rate of negative rate of real interest rates is also going to push up imports. You're going to import more gold. We're already doing that a lot the last 3-4 months. We're going to import maybe other goods as well because our own domestic production isn't great. And 3-4 years down the road, what looks like ample FX buffers might not be enough. Broad summary, a long answer. Fiscal monetary lever has limits. Let's not push that too much. Fiscal lever can be used, but I would be a lot happier if it went into productive investments, particularly into cleaning up the banking mess, cleaning up things like power and real estate and MSMEs. investing into jobs and output infrastructure, and of course into health education and healthcare and nutrition, etc. Productive stuff rather than just spraying money around. Eventually, the focus being real economy at the top has to create jobs and output. That has to be a single-minded goal, really.
I want to talk about jobs in detail, Anand, but that parallel that you drew about some people being billionaires while the large majority is actually turning poorer is a similar parallel for the capital market and what's happening with the large economy. I mean, do you expect to see a convergence at some point, or do you think it's going to remain like this, that there's, a different fund flow interest happening with what's going on with the equity markets, and they're not going to be sort of touched by what people are living through within this nation?
If I knew the answer to that, Mithali, I would be out trading. But I'll tell you my two-bit take on this one. This divergence can sustain for a while. It's already sustained for a while.
Yeah.
I think the starting point mistake we make is economists trying to predict markets and markets trying to say or trying to pretend that they know where the economy is headed. The two can remain divorced for a long, long time, precisely because of the conditions that you described. What's happened is that globally, central banks have pulled off the pedal of inflation control. That's very obvious, right? You have the Fed standing up and saying, I don't give a damn about inflation. I just want full employment and the economy to come back to where it was. Now, you already know that there are real fears of inflation, in the US rearing up, and the numbers are not looking great. You have this Paul Krugman versus Larry Summers kind of a debate happening as to what's going to give way. We don't know how that's going to pan out. But here is the thing. The US and developed markets have plenty of degrees of freedom to play around with. Their per capita income is much larger. Their ability to manage, hopefully, it's never easy. But if they have to start withdrawing the monetary pedal, I presume they can do it without causing too much of pain. Our conditions are very, very different. We are an emerging market. We don't have a hard currency that we print. We don't have a dollar or a euro that we print. We print our own rupee. And if you're not able to solve the jobs and output conundrum, you can lead to excesses, which eventually lead you to financial instability, like we saw in 2013. Now, that's a far, far way away, but it could absolutely happen. Now, so to answer your question, trying to play for a convergence in the short to medium term, I don't think is a good idea. As I see it, RBI will remain easy on monetary policy for the foreseeable future because, given the debilitating impact of the second wave, they will try and support the economy. They will probably see through inflation. And because of your FX reserves, you have a window of at least a year where you can afford to do that. There's plenty of firepower in the FX reserves to help for that, right? That could keep your divergence on for a long, long time. Now, eventually, yes, convergence will likely happen. It could happen in two ways. The nice, benign way, Mithali, is that we managed to solve for this jobs and output conundrum, and therefore the real economy slowly gravitates towards where the market valuations are. That would be great. I think it's within our reach. Is it going to be easy? No. Are we on the right path right now? No. But can we get there? We can. Okay. The other way, of course, is that the globe actually has its taper tantrum first. Inflation blows out, and therefore central banks start withdrawing liquidity. All of that spills over into India. We haven't got our act together at that point in time. Then you face all the risks that we can think of, including of inflation, including of exchange rate not looking as comfortable as it is today. Maybe even at some point a very wide divergence between the formal and informal can even cause social problems. We don't know how this is going to play out in a year's time or 2 years' time. So if you haven't got your Jobs and Output Act on the right path by that time, you could well have markets being the one that is vulnerable. But trying to play right now for that, frankly, makes very little sense. And eventually for investors, why is it that so many mom and pop, you have these Robin Hood kind of investors, even in India now, all putting money into equity markets? Frankly, they don't have a choice. If you're sitting on cash, if you're sitting on liquid funds, earning 3% or whatever post-tax, you're getting severely negative real rates of interest. So what do you do? So yeah, it's one of those things.
Anand, one can explain away so much of what we're living through now because of the pandemic, right? Businesses got hit, people got hit, get that. The one thing I have been struggling to understand is how we managed to ignore employment for so long. This one has been a ticking time bomb for quarter on quarter, and it's not been a small figure. It's been double digit unemployment figures for that crucial age group of 18 to 35 within urban India. I mean, we haven't even talked about the invisible urban poor. What was going on over there? I mean, how and why did we ignore this for so long?
Oh, it's a great point, Mitali, and I have lots of problem with our monetary policy framework. A lot of it is academic rabbit hole, so we won't get into it. One principal problem I have is, in the US, they look at employment and inflation together, right? So they're trying to kind of optimize for both, right? For instance, at this point in time, they're clearly telling us they're looking at employment and they're looking at durable employment rather than at inflation, right? An emerging market country like us, where we know that employment and domestic output is the starting point solution to all our proper problems, economic, social, whatever problems. We need jobs and output, right? And yet our monetary policy framework does not have any number to look at as far as employment is concerned, right? And here is the bigger conundrum. We have a CPI which comes out every month. We don't have a non-farm payroll equivalent, despite that being the single most determinant of our economic future, right? We are forced to look at CMIE and other surveys because guess what? The periodic labor force survey, which is the official one, comes back with the lag of 1 or 2 years, and even there is so much of noise about the numbers, you don't know what to go with. So you're absolutely spot on, right? I think if there is one metric that we've got to get right and pay a lot of attention to, it has to be the equivalent of a PLFS, a periodic labor force survey, done with much higher frequency and given a lot more of credibility. If that number it's probably the one medical report that we are not really looking at, and we don't have a way of looking at, which is why we keep talking about Azim Premji and CMI, etc. If we had that, I think a lot of our policy imperatives would be abundantly clear that we have to get the real economy part right. So assuming what CMI is telling us is right, or even half right, assuming what Azim Premji is telling us is half right, we've got a deadly problem of employment. I think that's the lowest common denominator of all our problems, frankly. So you're absolutely spot on right there.
One final question, Anant. You made the point earlier that if you really looked at sort of the real aspect of this figure, we're probably looking at double-digit contraction. I know it would be silly to ask you to look ahead because we've been through any number of alphabets, V, W, K, J, all of it. But what's your sense of how much more difficult this is going to be in terms of digging ourselves out of this hole?
I think it's going to be tremendously difficult, Mitali. Look, even before COVID hit us, even in March 2020, we were not looking great. That quarter, if you remember, I think we had 3.2% growth or something. It was the GDP trend was looking pretty bad. Employment trend was looking pretty bad. The numbers I gave you for manufacturing employment were looking terrible even as of March 2020, even before the lockdown started. So this COVID has only given a body blow to an already weak economy, right? The problems are intense. Yet there are solutions possible, Mitali, which is why, if you have to do a forecast of what would happen, a lot of it depends on the policy steps that we take. So I'll tell you what, I'll chart out what could give you manna from heaven, what could lead you to disaster. I'll also try and tell you what is my sense of where we stand as of now, okay? As I mentioned earlier, there are 4 things I think that we ought to focus on, okay? I'm leaving the obvious ones out first. Vaccination, clearly a must. By December, we should have confidence of some kind of herd immunity being there. I think it will happen, by the way. I think New Delhi understands that is absolutely imperative for both political as well as economic survival. Therefore, hopefully we will get it done. Okay, so that's one part. The second part that you mentioned about making sure that there is a safety net provided to everybody, including the 20% that APU talks about, to everybody. Nobody should have a problem of food, about medical health, about the basic sustenance because of lack of funds. So that has to be taken care of as well. Okay. Thereafter, more medium term, as I said, 4 things that I would look at. First, the immediate one, clean up the financial services ecosystem. It is in no shape to fund our growth right now. Okay. whether it's a bad bank, whether it's a PGNI committee recommendations, whatever, cleanse the damn thing, get us in a position to actually fund growth. Related to that, lots of chronic sectors that we've pushed under the carpet, especially through the COVID-19 situation. Power is a mess. It was a mess even before COVID. I mean, discoms are in a mess. Clean that damn thing up. It's dragging down your growth impetus, right? Real estate, for God's sake, get that thing cleaned up. It's in the right path. RERA is happening. Lots of other things can happen, but clean it up. Again, related to the financial services ecosystem, airline and shipping, telecom, MSMEs, clean these things up. Lock the relevant stakeholders in the room. Throw the key away. Don't let them out until they have a solution. And solutions are possible for those sectors. Third part, continue on this process of Atmanirbhar Bharat. You have to tweak it. Don't impose import controls and stuff like that. You need to have a much more different approach to that. But the focus is right. Land reforms, labor reforms, capital reforms, judicial reforms, contract enforceability, policy stability. Don't have retrospective nonsense thrown at corporates. Don't change the rules of the game after they've invested in India. All that has to be addressed to get your jobs and output up. Okay, so these three things for the short to medium term. Long term, look, we have no idea how we're going to provide. I keep saying jobs, but the reality, Mithali, is at a time of automation, artificial intelligence, and all of that, we have no idea where jobs are going to come from, right? The best solutions lie with our kids themselves. If we give them education, if we give them nutrition, stunting is at 35%, 0 to 5 years of age. It's a shame. You're not allowing their brains to develop. How on earth are they going to stand up and look after themselves and us, right? So education, healthcare, nutrition, sanitation, we've never made these important. You talked about employment not being measured. None of these seem to count for our electoral metrics, right? In any of our discussions. But if you invest in this, if you invest in our children, they will take care of our future and of us. That has to be our best investment possible. They will figure out how to make money, how to survive. Indians are smart enough. Give the Indian the nutrition and education he or she requires. They'll take care of us. So these four things, I think, is what we need to focus on. Am I seeing that focus happening right now? No, Mithali. I'm saying I'm not asking for all four. At least give us 60% of this. At this point in time, I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing slivers, to be honest. I'm seeing, for instance, I do think healthcare will get an impetus now. We've got such a shock that healthcare will get an impetus. I'm hoping and praying education gets an impetus as well. I'm hoping and praying, sometimes it takes us a crisis to resolve these things. I'm hoping and praying banking and power, real estate gets solved as well. As of now, but a lot of work needs to be done. And the approach to getting these things have to also change. Doing it centrally from a prime minister's office in Delhi is not the way of, implementing these second generation reforms. You need to take the country together at the local district level. China became China because of 50 mayors in 50 provinces, not because of one central Beijing running the show. So we can have a long discussion about that. If we don't go down this path adequately, unfortunately, we are going to underperform our seriously high potential, and we would be lurching from one risk to the other. I don't think we'll ever have a situation where we have an existential crisis. India is too strong for that. Our people are too good for that. But we'll just be completely underperforming our potential. We don't want another year where we are labeled as having per capita income below Bangladesh, for God's sake, right? We want to be compared to China, not with Bangladesh. But yeah, no crystal ball gazing at this point in time. Potential is high. Not on the right path as yet, but I still have my hopes up.
No, you're absolutely right, Anant. I came across Dr. Kaushik Basu's tweet today, and 142 amongst 194 nations. That's where we are in terms of ranking. So I think you're right. It's time to really sort of bite the bullet, take it on the chin, and just roll up your sleeves and do something about it. Thank you so much for such a rich and forthright conversation. I really appreciate your time today, and it's been really great chatting with you, Anant.
Thanks for having me, Mithali. My pleasure, yeah. And all the best.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.